Welcome to See Beneath Your Beautiful, where guests share stories of adversity and perseverance, which inspire, encourage, and challenge us. We embrace these tough conversations, intimately exploring our loves, fears, and hopes with a delicious combination of depth and lightness.
My name is Nicolette Samash. I am originally from Alaska, moved to Spokane in 2017. I'm a real estate agent, a single mom, to a daughter with special needs. She has a rare genetic condition.
Your daughter's 5 now, right?
Yes, she is.
And what's her name?
Leah.
Leah. She was progressing normally until she was about 1, and then something happened. So want to talk about that?
My daughter, Leah, was born premature. So she was born at 36 weeks. I had to be induced. I had something called cholestasis that a lot of people don't know about, but where you get itchy hands and feet. And it turns out that your liver is not processing toxins correctly. And so it can be pretty immediate that you have to be induced because it can cause toxic shock to the baby. They can just have a heart attack spontaneously. So they can be fine, everything's fine, and then they have a heart attack. So I didn't want to deal with any of that, so I got induced, had her a month early. She was pretty small, but she did very well and really caught up quickly. So she was reaching all of her milestones early. She said her first words around 4 months old. She said, Mama, Dada, Baba. She has always been very motivated by food, so she ate really early, especially considering she was a preemie. Like, she just loves food. And she rolled over super fast. She was thriving. And then when she was about 6 months old, we moved to Spokane, and she was doing really well, but she struggled to sit up on her own. She did eventually get it, but it definitely took some work. My aunt definitely noticed that she was struggling a little bit more than normal to sit up. So she started propping her up with pillows and working with her on it every day. And then pretty quickly she was able to sit up on her own. So it was like, okay, no big deal. It took her a very long time to crawl. She was about a year old and still not crawling. And that's when we went in for like a regular checkup. And at this point, everyone had told me, everything's fine. Babies progress differently. She is fine. So we go in and see the doctor, and I remember her doing the examination, and I was pretty calm. You know, I was like, okay, maybe she'll recommend physical therapy, which she did. But then she looks at me and she goes, there's something wrong with her. I don't know what it is. Something is wrong. I think you need to get an MRI. I think you need to have genetic testing. Something is wrong. And I was so shocked. I was like, what are you talking about? And this particular doctor, it was our first time seeing her, and she was a little socially off. And so it just was very abrupt. And I was confused. I'm like, well, why do you say that? And she's like, I'm just telling you from my experience, something's wrong, but there was nothing to put your finger on. So I'm like, this woman's psycho. What is she talking about? I leave the office bawling, of course, call my mom, and she's like, okay, she doesn't know what she's talking about. She barely knows her. She was in there with her for 30 minutes. She's fine. There's no problem. So I kind of shook it off, started taking her to physical therapy. It started with once a week, and then they weren't making progress, so they upped it a couple times, and eventually we were going 5 times a week to physical therapy. So every day of the week we were going, or they were coming to the house. Physical therapy turned into occupational therapy, or OT, which is sensory related, because they were noticing that there was definitely some sensory issues going on. And then, which quickly turned into speech, because she wasn't making any progress. She had said those first initial words, but then it kind of became less frequent that she would say them. And then there was no new words being added. So at this point, she was about a year and a half and making no progress, even with practically continuous therapies. We had seen multiple different doctors, which is a horrible experience, I'll tell you, for like developmental disabilities in Spokane, because either you have people who blow you off, or you have doctors who can just come across almost too intense. I remember we saw this one doctor I was really excited about because she was like well known. She had transferred over from Seattle. I wrote out this whole chart of everything, every little tiny thing I could think of that was going on to help her, and brought it in. And she was like, okay, we need to do X, Y, and Z. And it was just really overwhelming for me. And I was trying to say, okay, well, where can we start? I just need a starting place. Like, give me a starting place, give me one thing to focus on at a time. And she got really frustrated and said, we have so many people on the waiting list to get all this testing that if you're not interested in it, then your daughter doesn't deserve to be on it, and just like stormed out of the room. And then we were going to therapies so often, and those were brutal. Every time they'd come, they'd have to tell me, okay, every visit they were doing this, where Leah was at on a developmental chart. So they would give me like her developmental age versus like her actual age. That is, I just think, a terrible thing for people to do, because when you're looking at my kid who's obviously struggling and telling me, oh, your 1.5-year-old really is like a 8-month-old over and over every single day. And we're doing everything that we know, or that I knew to do. And I'm taking her to the therapies. It's like torture, honestly. Like, I was bawling after every appointment. I had no idea what to do. Initially, it felt like a lot of blame. They'd be like, well, what are you doing at home? Like, maybe I was doing something to cause it. And they'd always be like, well, you're just not working with her enough. You need to spend more time. And I'm like, I am a single mom. I am working. I'm bringing her to these appointments every single day, taking her to specialists. I come home and I work with her for an hour to 2 hours every single night. Like, she is past her level of frustration. I don't know what else I can possibly do. And then they started coming to the visits and bringing in like the managers from the office, and they were having these meetings about me and meetings about Leah. It was awful. And at one point they brought like the manager, or whatever, maybe it was like the head PT. I don't even know exactly who it was. And he goes, I just don't think you're understanding it. I'm looking at your daughter right now. And she used to have these abnormal eye movements where she would kind of roll her eyes up briefly. And he said, she is having seizures and you're not taking it seriously enough. And I said, I have brought her to her pediatrician. We are waiting to get into neurology. We are waiting to get an MRI. We are on the list for all these things. But in Spokane, I don't know if you know this, it's common knowledge in the special needs community, it can take 6 months to a year to get in for your first neurology appointment. So these scheduling issues were not within my control. Her pediatrician was calling, trying to get her in. And I remember looking at the PT and saying, I don't think you're qualified to say if my daughter is having seizures or not. And I am taking this as seriously as I know how. If you're not going to give me something helpful, something that I can do, something that's within my control, I'm not sure why your office keeps repeating these things to me at every visit. And shortly after that, I took her into the office to see her OT, and she had another like intervention meeting with me. We were sitting there trying to work with some fine motor skills with Leah with her hands, which part of her condition, I mean, one of the key characteristics is loss of hand control. So hand and fine motor has been an enormous struggle. A lot of people with Rett have no functional use of their hands whatsoever. Leah definitely struggles with that as well. Of course, at the time, we didn't know that she had Rett syndrome, which is her genetic condition. And the OT said, I just don't think you're getting it. Again, she said, she is the worst patient that I have, the worst patient in this entire clinic. That's what I need you to understand.
The worst, meaning the worst in terms of development, or what does that mean?
Those were her exact words. The way that I took it, she was like the worst off. Like, she is like doing the worst.
I see.
I was just done at that point. I was like, you know what? I don't know how saying things like that helps us. I'm here listening. I'm taking all of your advice.
Yeah.
I just think that that is a cruel way of you trying to get my attention. And you have it. You've had it for the past year. Like, we've done everything you guys have said.
Yeah.
And I said, if you're not going to give me something helpful, obviously this isn't working. The way that we're going about this isn't working. She's not making progress. I'm bawling every day. I'm barely able to function at work. Whatever solution we find, like, this is not going to work. my daughter's confidence was destroyed because it was at that point. We'd pull up to the therapy office and she would just start bawling and screaming, sometimes until we left. And then the second we'd leave, she was like fine again. So she hated it.
What did the lady want you to do? What was she trying to?
I have no idea. To this day, I don't know. And I walked out on the appointment and I never took her back. I blocked their number. They tried to call and apologize. I actually got a call from the owner of the clinic. Obviously, he wasn't involved in any of this. He didn't hear all those conversations. He was a very, very nice man. I was so beaten down at that point. I literally, at the time, was like, I don't know if my daughter's going to die. I don't know if she is having seizures. I feel like such a failure as a mom. Like, I don't know if I am doing something wrong. It was a very stressful time. So at that point, I kind of took a step back. I stopped all the therapies for about 6 months. I waited for her to get in for her appointments. I went to the ocean, actually. And I was like, okay, so obviously something is wrong. And with that scenario in mind, I have to focus on how are we going to get through life knowing that there's something like this wrong? How am I going to protect her joy in life? Because it was gone at that point.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't even look at her without seeing a developmental chart. Every time I look at her, I would just think, okay, here's her shortcomings. Here's where she's not measuring up, because that is kind of how the medical system works for younger children like that. I couldn't look at her like my daughter anymore. It was more like she was a project. And so I am so thankful that we took some time away. And in that time, she actually started walking, which was incredible. I really think taking the pressure off and like letting her kind of explore on her own and being able to just passively work on it and make it fun really allowed her to be able to do that. So she took her first steps, which has still been a long road, taken a long time for her to be able to walk. I guess I would say like more normally and more consistently and build up that stamina. So then we eventually get in to see neurology. Neurology says, well, it's nothing neurological. It's probably genetic. We get in to see genetics. They say, well, she doesn't line up with any genetic criteria that we know of. We'll run the test, but we don't think it's genetic. We think it's neurological. So I'm getting bounced back and forth. In the meantime, she's diagnosed with autism. That was like the number one. Every time we walked into a clinic, they'd say, oh, she's got autism. Oh, it's autism. And it just never felt right to me. And I remember telling the developmental pediatrician once, she said, 100% she's got autism. And I said, okay, I know that everybody's saying that. And honestly, I want to believe that because autism is something I could understand. I would love to just say, okay, it's autism and start focusing on how to work with that. I just don't feel like it is. And I know I'm not a medical professional. I get it. I've read the criteria and she is like just so social, so lovey, which girls can be with autism, but I just didn't feel like it was right. The first round of genetic testing came back fine. And she also had genetic testing when she was first born in Alaska. They do that for all the newborns. All of it was fine. The geneticist goes, okay, that all came back fine. We also have something called an autism panel that we can run that basically is all of these things that can present similar to autism. At this point, she's a little bit after she had turned 2. So we had kind of been working on this for a really long time.
Yeah.
And he said, if you want, we can run this autism panel that tests for all these other things. I think it's going to come back fine. But he said, I'm retiring. So, if I run it now, you're probably going to get results through somebody else. But, it's one last thing I can do for you guys since I know you don't have an answer yet. And I said, okay, well, let's do it, even though everybody's telling me it's probably not genetic. Then I took her to see a new pediatrician. This was like our 4th one. I took her in and we were there for about 30 minutes. It was the first doctor that we saw who made any effort to connect with her one-on-one. The rest of them would just sit back, observe her, talk to me, and like pretend that she wasn't a human being. It was a horrible, horrible feeling. It was like she was like this lab specimen that people were observing. And I get that, like, that's kind of how you're trained in medical school. But because of that, I never saw them see her personality, which is why I think there was a disconnect. Is I'm like, if you would just interact with her like a human being, like you would see a lot more of her come out. We walked in, we saw this new doctor, and after being with us for about 30 minutes, she looks at me and she goes, I see here that she's diagnosed with autism. I got to tell you, I don't buy it. And I was like, really? Because that's exactly how I'm feeling. She's like, something's definitely wrong. I don't see autism. I see autistic girls all the time. I've seen, a lot of autistic boys. I know that if you just look at her symptoms in a chart, it absolutely looks like autism. I don't see it.
Mm-hmm.
That she's so engaged. She is so affectionate. It's not the same. I can't even tell you the relief I felt just to hear that from somebody else. Mm-hmm. And it's not that like I didn't want her to have autism or something. It's nothing like that. It just wasn't right. And I knew it in my core. And just that validation of like, okay, you're not crazy, was like, thank you for that. Genetic testing takes a long time to come back. Months. So at this point, I definitely didn't think that genetic testing would come back with anything since the geneticist has said he didn't think it would. We had done all the tests. We did a sleep-deprived EEG. We tested for seizures. All of it came back negative, which makes me really pissed off about that physical therapist who told me in no uncertain terms that she was having seizures because, again, he was not qualified to say that. And, I just was kind of like, okay, well, we don't know what it is, but, it doesn't really change how we work on things. So I accepted it. And at this point, she was actually making pretty good progress. She was walking now. She had started eating with some silverware. I had to help her, but she was like, starting to do that. We were working on fine motor skills all the time. She definitely was still delayed, but it was kind of like this moment of acceptance. And I also still had very high hopes for the future because I'm like, she's made all this progress so far. Mm-hmm. I think it'll be okay. I think she'll have differences, but I think we'll be okay. Then I get a call from the genetic office months later, and they're like, okay, we'd like you to come in to go over the results. And at this point, I'm just like, I'm so sick of appointments. I'm tired of them. Can we please just talk about it over the phone? And they're like, no, it's our policy that you have to come in to talk about the genetic results. And I remember like really pushing back on it. Like, I don't want to come in. Can you please just give me the results over the phone? I was positive they were going to say that it was nothing, that they didn't find anything. Because up to that point, this was like 2 years. We had been bouncing around and talking to everybody, and nobody had any clue what was going on. Being a single mom with a child with struggles, and at the time, she still was eating dairy sometimes, so she had just constant stomach aches, and I didn't know they were stomach aches because she couldn't communicate that. And so she just would have these massive screaming fits sometimes at like the most random times. And so like to take her in Sacred Heart, you have to park in the parking garage. I'd have to carry her onto the elevator. She would flip out because at this point she had like PTSD from doctor's appointments after the therapy office. It took us years for her to now be comfortable going into doctor's offices again. So she would almost always launch into these huge screaming fits, and I'd have to hold her and she'd be hitting me. And it was like, I don't want to do this again. So I set up an appointment to come in, and even that appointment, just to go over the results, was like 3 weeks out. Like it was not an early thing. So I go in, and I remember being in like a good mood because I had just been like, okay, I just accept this, that we're not going to know. It's fine. I go back, and they put me in this like room. It's like a calming room, kind of. And I was like, that's weird. I haven't been in here before. And I'm like giving her like crackers to remember, I'm like talking to her, and she's all giggly and goofy by the time, because she had already done her whole fit on the way in. They were sitting like forever, and these people keep checking on me, and I'm like, gosh, this is a weird vibe. Like these, like, I don't know, like aides or assistants who are keeping like, okay, it's just going to be a little bit longer. Like, are you okay? I'm like, yeah. And then the geneticist comes in, who's new because the other one retired. So this is a woman geneticist. And she like sits down and she goes, okay, the genetic testing came back with something. And I'm like, oh, wow, I didn't expect that at all. What is it? And she goes, okay, don't look this up online. Hear everything that I'm about to say before you react or before you start Googling things. And I just want you to listen to me first and keep in mind that I am the expert in this field. And if you go on Google, it's going to terrify you. And I'm like, what are you about to say? And meanwhile, Leah's sitting there eating her little chips and walking around the room. She's going up to them and patting their leg, hi, and smiling. And I'm like, what is the big deal? She goes, okay, she has something called Rett syndrome is what it came back with. She has what's called an atypical presentation for it. So I want you to really keep that in mind when you're Googling or when you're looking things up. We really have only known about the atypical presentation of Rett syndrome for a few years, so there's really not a lot of information and studies that we have to go off of. And she gives me these handouts that kind of go over it, which I know now were kind of softened versions explaining Rett syndrome, because the first sheet was about classic Rett syndrome. And then the second sheet had some atypical presentations of Rett syndrome, some different projections of what that could look like. And there was the classic was a neurodegenerative disorder caused by a mutation in the X chromosome. It said it can only affect girls. The first word I remember reading that really stood out was neurodegenerative, because every appointment we had been to up to that point with all the specialists, I said, do you feel like she has a progressive condition? Every single one was no, because she's never regressed. So she had just plateaued. They were we don't think that she has anything progressive or anything crazy like that. Every single person had said that, even the geneticist that we went to originally. And I remember looking at her and saying, this says neurodegenerative. So can you explain that to me? And she said, neurodegenerative generally is more associated with classic Rett syndrome, but it can happen. With someone like Leah, what we have seen progressively, the biggest thing she could look for is progressively less eye contact and progressively worse control over her hands. Those are the two top things that we see. It was so much because I'm looking at her and she's fine. I was just so proud of her because she walked all the way in there, I'm we're doing good. What? I feel we've made so many gains recently. I remember her saying, this is the part that I have to say, and I need you to understand that the chances of her ever being able to live independently are less than 1%. Up until this point, I'm okay, she's going to be different. Maybe she's got some things going on. I watch these TV shows about autistic people. They get their sensory things. They find their coping mechanisms. And then of course they have savant syndrome or something, and they become really fantastic in certain areas. And at that point, I was still thinking okay, she's going to go to college, how do I help her get to these further points? And I just thought, okay, so she's going to be pretty speech delayed. What is the reason that people with Rett can't live independently? Because it just seems at this point, there's so much potential for that. And she says, the problem is just because she's progressed recently does not mean she's going to progress in the future. If there is progression, it's substantially slower. And there's just so many physical hurdles to overcome. She said simple things like eating independently, bathing. She's listing off these very simple things to me. And I'm just what? I just never in 1,000 years would have expected that. Leah didn't have the severe regression. She just plateaued. She reached a certain point, plateaued for a while, then was able to make some more gains. And that's kind of how things with her have continued. Every little gain has taken enormous work, tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of focused work. And then she'll have a little breakthrough. And then it's tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of work, little breakthrough. It is incredibly difficult to have intentional movement. It's that communication between your intention and action that really gets completely disrupted. So it can be an incredibly frustrating condition for people who have it, because it's not like they're not in there. It's not like they don't want to speak and have things to say and want to do things, but it just doesn't come out. And just using their body is so hard and sometimes impossible, really. It's a brutal one.
I'm wondering about you because you look rested and healthy. Your outlook seems positive. And so what are you doing for you? How are you getting through it? And I know you were saying that there's beauty in it and it's not just the diagnosis. So tell me a little bit about you.
Once she was diagnosed, the aftermath of that was brutal on me. You know, I have Leah at home. I have no childcare, and I'm just like, just done. So a lot of times will get headaches and like body inflammation in response to stress. And so I got just this horrible migraine and I couldn't get out of it. So I'm like laying on the couch. I'm just puking. I'm trying to take Excedrin, puking some more, blacking out, coming out of it. And I'm like trying to watch her. She's like hungry and needs me to make her food and all this stuff. And I just can't move. Like literally every time I move, I puke. I finally got a friend to watch her and I went to urgent care and I explained the situation to them and I'm like bawling, like just like hyperventilating, bawling, just trying to talk and explain and get help. I'm like, I can't have this migraine. Like I am a single mom. I have nobody else to take care of her. I don't know a lot of people here. Like give me a shot or something. Like I need to be able to go home and function and get through this. You know, I've got like work appointments. I can't get through this right now. They gave me something, but it was not like a painkiller or anything. I kind of feel like they were like on the fence on if I was just seeking like prescription pills or something. So that didn't help at all. I still had the migraine. The doctor came in and talked to me and he's like, here's a list of counselors in town. I think you really need to talk to somebody. And I agreed. I'm like, I do. I would love to talk to somebody. Like, please. I'll call the whole list. So I go home, call the list. At this point, I was low. I remember feeling like if we got in a car accident on the way home, it would be a better outcome for her than this disease.
I understand.
And I couldn't get rid of that thought. I wasn't ever going to do it, but I'm like, I do need to talk to somebody. I recognize that. So I called 7 people on the list that he gave me. I called my local clinic. I called all kinds of people I could find on Google. Every single one was full. 6 months booked out. Nobody could talk to me. This is like a critical point for me. I need somebody to talk to. I need some help. I like couldn't even cry anymore. And I called my mom who lives in Alaska and I'm like, I'm done. I have nothing left in me. And she was like, okay, we're going to come. I really was only able to sleep for like an hour or two at a time because every time I was sleeping, I was having these horrible nightmares. So it was like, I just couldn't get back on track for a while. So they showed up and I just was like, okay, take over. Like, I'm out. It was definitely a rough time. Thankfully, my mom and my sisters just did everything for me. It was amazing. They actually they lived with me for probably 6 months. And the first month, I just didn't get out of bed. And I just couldn't do anything. I couldn't look at her. I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't function. What really helped me, well, number one, I was super angry with God. I felt like having her in the first place and doing everything that we had done, I felt like I had done out of faith. I had always tried to do what I felt God was like directing me to do. So I felt betrayed. I felt very betrayed that something like this would happen to Leah and not like my friends and their children who weren't acting maybe on so much faith, or at least like from my perspective. That was just how I was thinking at the time. And I prayed and yelled at God a lot in my prayers. And then there was this point after I moved into my new house, it's probably been like a couple weeks, and I was praying and praying, and I read some scripture and praying. And I just remember feeling this word, like I didn't hear it, but I just heard it in my head, peace. And it was like the furthest thing from what I was thinking about, but I just felt it. And then I felt the peace and I slept. Like I literally just fell asleep. And I slept for like 14 hours. And I woke up and it was just night and day. Like, it was the first time I was able to sleep without like waking up from a nightmare like an hour later. And that was huge. And then shortly after that, I started a notebook. And anytime I would think something positive, I'd hear something positive, I would read a scripture, anything throughout my day that would encourage me in any way, shape, or form, just be like the smallest sliver of hope or joy or something that would make me laugh or anything, I'd write it down. And then a couple hours later, I'd feel horrible and just, not be able to stop the thoughts and everything. And I'd open it and I would just read through the entire thing. And doing that was really helpful because I focused on the encouragement. And what I realized is that there are uncountable ways that we experience pain in this life. And I realized at a certain point that even though people aren't going through the exact same thing as me, even though it's very difficult to find people out there who have children with Rett syndrome, but in particular atypical Rett syndrome, I am absolutely not alone in feeling pain to this degree. Like, pain is pain, it's universal. To me, it was a huge breakthrough because it meant if they can get through it, I can get through it. If people going through these other horrible things that are not exactly the same can find a way to find joy again and have a positive outlook and have an impact in the world, then I can do it too. And also, just that relation to other people, that connection made me feel much less alone. The other thing that really helped me start to move forward is I had to accept that there are things that I can't control, that are completely outside my control. I think it's a really hard thing for parents to do because we have our children and we see them as this extension of ourselves. For me, especially being a single mom, Leah just became my whole world. Mm-hmm. Our identities, in my mind, were melded together. And I just thought if I do the right things, if I feed her the right foods and if I follow the right parenting advice, that I can somehow control her outcomes. Bringing it back on me, maybe if I can be a better parent, maybe if I can work with her more. And then to get something like a genetic diagnosis that has these terrible outcomes associated with it, I've definitely doubled down on the effort, but I've had to let go of that control simultaneously. I've had to be like, okay, I just can't manage it all if it's within my control. We are meant to be stewards of our children. They're their own individuals and they ultimately belong to God. And that's a distinction and a separation that I had to make. I had to stop seeing her as being this fused person to myself and see her as being a completely separate person with her own identity, with her own purpose. And I was just there to care for her, to do my best, but to have a purpose of my own that was separate from that. And that took a lot of the feelings of being responsible for what was happening and feeling responsible for the pain that she was going through away. And it allowed me to be, I believe, a better mom and just a better human being. I can't rewrite her genes. I can't take away all of her struggles. I don't think that I'm meant to have that control. I think other people who go through a lot of trials and trauma, I think that they get that, and they have been the ones who have taught me that, to really just focus on what you can control and then embrace what exists that's outside of that control. Mm-hmm. I was just at church last week and they said this concept of my life is not my own. I've had to really think about that and see Leah's condition instead of being a punishment, which kind of went along with me feeling so angry with God because I felt like, why are you punishing us? Like, what did I possibly do to deserve this? What could my daughter have done to deserve this? But it's not a punishment, it's a placement. I think that we are placed here. She was placed in this situation. I was placed here as her mom to have an impact that we can only have in this role in life. I don't always understand it, but I think that we've been placed here for a reason.
I think that's so beautiful. I really appreciate the mentality, and it's all you can do. Otherwise, you're suffering.
It's so easy to just slip into the pain of it all and kind of disappear into that. You are going to come up against a choice, and you can choose to just get lost in this, or you can choose to grieve and then pick yourself back up and just make a beautiful life. Choose joy, choose faith, move past it.
Well, that's the point of the podcast, is that, I was sexually abused as a young girl. I lost my mother when I was 18. And I wasted a lot of years being the victim of so many things. The minute I took responsibility for what I have done and accepted the things I wished I had done different, and just loved what is and accepted what was and knew for myself what was out of control, it really found a peace. And so I just appreciate that that's what you're saying, especially in this hard situation. So thank you.
Yeah, wow, that's really beautiful. I need to go back and listen to your story more.
I just really just want everybody to see the beauty in themselves and in even the struggles, because life is beautiful and it's short, and we got to embrace it. What do you want people to know about Leah?
What I want people to know about Leah and about people like Leah is that, number one, their futures are never predetermined by our scientific predictions. I've seen all kinds of anomalies or exceptions to the rule. And I think that's important, especially for other special needs parents, to understand that even with something like a genetic condition that seems so set in stone, there's so much of that also goes down to genetic expression. There's so much we can do for our kids. There's so many things that I've found that I've seen her thrive with, that if we would have just given up and accepted that this is what it is, we never would have kept looking to find those things. And I also want people to understand that she's a person just like anybody else.
Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of See Beneath Your Beautiful, hosted by Hara Allison. And thanks for your ratings and reviews. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Stay tuned.